Hello, everyone. Hello, Dom. How are
Hi,
you?
Mike. Um, you are an excellent human being. That's all I wanted to say.
Ah, so are you, mate?
You're going to talk about state.
Yes.
So
Should we
please,
start?
you should start. I'm going to give you the
Yeah.
screen and I'm going to be quiet and then off you go. And please, if anyone has questions, put them in the chat and we have a Q&A session afterwards.
Cool. If anyone needs an intermission or anything like that, get a drink, go to the bathroom, can do that. The first part of my talk's pretty boring anyway. So you can see my screen now, correct? If I can just find my presentation, we'll get started. Look at that. All right, I'm going to assume that everyone can see that. I hope you'll tell me if we can't, Dom, because I have very little feedback. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat or anything like that. So that means I'm going to have to come back and read whatever you're writing right now, Jess, later.
It all looks
I will.
perfect.
But hi, everyone. I'm Mike. I'm a web developer from Sydney, Australia. Some of you have seen me speak before. I don't think I've spoken at the Design System Meetup before, so I'm really excited to do that. And I am going to be talking about the state of UI. Just few little things about myself, I guess. I've been a web developer for about 10 years. I've worked for Australian government. I do some work for Smashing Magazine. I work with ThinkMill on Keystone.js. You can ask me about any of those things. And I've worked on a lot of different design systems and on a lot of different teams implementing design systems. I'm primarily a front-end developer, so I've come up with a few sort of like ways I like to work with the different state of components, and I want to talk about that and how it relates to design systems today. As well as that, I'm actually moving house. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but like my backdrop is all like boxes and stuff. Um, so I just want to sort of like set that scene for you as well. Anyway, that's enough about me. The title of my talk is The State of UI. So we have an agenda tonight, and there's a few things that I want to start by defining. And I think that is especially important for a design system meetup because design systems are essentially communication tools, and we need to go about creating this like shared vocabulary for fuzzy words like state or tokens or components. So I want to start by talking about tokens because I think that's really foundational, and this will build up to some of my thoughts about how we manage state in UI components. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the different types of UI state that we have. And then finally, hopefully tie this all together to talk about how we can manage this as designers or as developers, or forgetting any of those titles, just as like unique individuals who collaboratively build stuff for the web, because that's what we all kind of are. So I'm going to ask a few questions during this talk. And like I said, I can't actually see the chat while I'm giving the talk. So drop your answers in there anyway. We can chat about them later. The first question I have for you is, what is a design token? And I'm going to ask, is this a design token? 378EFO. And a lot of you will probably say, no, that's just a color. But if we add a little tag on it like that, is that a token? And some of you might say yes to that. And then like now we can have like a set of tokens, right, with these colors, and we can give them all little names, and we have a theme palette. But this doesn't need to be a color, right? This can be like a font size or a spacing unit, or pretty much anything else. And this is kind of where we all started, or it's where I started in the evolution of design systems, right? It was just variables, probably in SAS, or I think it was less when I started doing this kind of stuff. And that's how we actually might have been PHP where I started doing this stuff. Anyway, but this is where we sort of started, and then we started to realize that like many of these things actually change in unison, right? We realized that variable names like blue aren't very good. So anyway, we realized, okay, we have these scales rather than individual tokens, and rather than changing the individual value of a font size or a spacing or a color variable, it probably made more sense to reference some point in this scale rather than using a fixed value. We have options when it comes to implementing how we do this. And I think this is where it gets difficult, right? This is the pointy end of design systems and where stuff sort of starts to fall down. So for example, an application could change the value of a token, or we could say have a specific UI element that should use a different token, and which is the best option. And I'm interested to know right now in the chat, even though I can't see it, which you think is the better option. And I'm also interested to know if people are having about this or theorizing about how this should be implemented in any given project. And my personal experience has been that the theorizing is always left to the last minute, and whoever's implementing it. and that the correct answer to which of those was the best option is probably both, and it depends on context. So that's my first sizzling tip for everyone here. That is that theming is probably a replacement of the entire color palette and other global scales. Theming is largely a global concern, so it should probably change base tokens in that way. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So that was an example of a theme change from light to dark. And many of you might have thought that just the background changed. The reason being that the color changes were subtle, right? We perceive color differently on different backgrounds. And I might want the same base colors, but nonetheless, all of those values were updated to work better with more contrast or comprehension against either a light or a dark background. Themes can have like completely different brands with completely different sets of color. They can adjust more than just color palettes. They can adjust spacing and other things. And you might be thinking, okay, but I also have like components that like change dramatically for a given theme. And I'll come back to that particular problem. But for now, I want you to think of like theming as mostly changing global tokens. And that's our first type of token that we have in a lot of design systems. So you know when I say global token here, that's what I'm referring to. Now we have this kind of shared vocabulary and understanding of what that means. And I hope that you can sort of like bring some of that to your team as well. I'm drinking orange juice out of a wine glass because that's all I have left after packing up all of my glasses. Okay, so the next step in giving tokens meaning is to sort of like, or the next step is to give tokens meaning, right? So we have these variables, and we all know that like blue is not a fantastic variable. And there's many reasons why you might use like something on your scale like blue 500. So by giving that semantic meaning, we can differentiate between different types of use. So for example, here I have a CTA background color, a call to action background color. And that might make sense to use blue 500 for that, but we might also use blue 500 for something else. Maybe it's also the link color. But those two uses are kind of different, right? So it makes sense to sort of give that a bit more meaning. And then we can have like a little collection of colors with sort of related meanings, and they can change in unison, and everything's good. And this is a different type of token, right? These are useful as well. And we're going to call these alias tokens. So these alias tokens, they kind of like reference the global tokens rather than referencing the different colors themselves. So it's kind of like a hierarchy of tokens. And the reason you might want that, right, is that like different components can change depending on the global tokens or depending on these alias tokens in different ways. So this is an example of a component that exists on the Smashing Magazine website. And I've taken the palette that we had earlier and I've applied it to this token, right? We've got the orange color there for the button. We've got a blue background, white text, etc. And it makes sense in Sketch or Figma to think about like which type of token is most appropriate for the different like elements in this design. Is it a global token or is it an alias token? So the ones that I've highlighted in yellow here, these are examples of global tokens. I don't want those things to change when my theme changes, right? So the color of the cat, the blue ring around him, probably, maybe that does change, but I'm going to say it doesn't. I'm also going to say that the background of inputs is always going to be white because I want them to be clear and comprehensible no matter what theme. But these other things, they're going to change, right? So we have yellow, which is global tokens. We have white, which is alias tokens, and components have these different concerns, right? Which ones they should reference. And that's where we get to this third type of token, right? This is component specific tokens. And as I said, they can reference different types depending on what's expected of the component itself. So these component specific tokens can also change with the change what they reference, but generally they don't change with the theme, right? So the first two types kind of change with the theme, but these ones, if you're updating the theme, you're not going to update the alias tokens. You might change sort of which alias token it points to or something like that. For all of these, you should probably lock the names. So like, once you've decided on names for these things, they shouldn't change very much. So I just want to quickly recap the types of tokens that we've talked about here. We have global tokens, which reference scales, which reference fixed values. We have alias tokens, which reference those global tokens. And we have component tokens too, which are generally sort of like fixed in a way that the other two aren't. The other two change more dynamically with theme changes. I want to acknowledge here that I've ripped like a whole heap of this from the Adobe Spectrum design system. And it's one of the only places that I actually see people talking about different types of tokens and how they're used. And despite that, it's actually like a really small section. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at it. But what I actually want to see is more people like talking about how they're using these in their teams and writing blog posts and sending me a link so that I can read and learn more about this. I'm really surprised that there isn't sort of like more discussion of this out there. Anyway, so that's the first sort of like part of my talk. That's tokens. And finally, we get to talk about state. Okay, so I'm going to ask the question, what does state mean? And once again, if you could throw answers in the chat for me, I'll get to read that later. For me, I define state as like, or at least I define like UI state as something that's different from application state. But sadly, I think those two things are often conflated in the conversations that we have or in how we build applications. I think that UI state, or from like a perspective of design systems, perspective of a front-end developer, I think that UI state refers to different layouts or color variations that are applied like mostly when a user interacts with a component, but not always. So they're basically like, you know, the variations or states that a component has that need to be mapped out in our sketches or our design system or whatever. And I think that there's 3 different types of UI state that are quite distinct. The first one is modifier state. Now, these are top-level variations in design. And the thing that identifies, for me, modifier state is that it's not dependent on your application state, right? The type of state that the developers might be thinking about when you talk to them about the state. We're more talking about like the different, you know, visual states that this UI component can be in. And those can be applied just as a stylistic choice. Examples of those might include things like size, primary, secondary buttons, position of maybe an image within like a media object component or something like that. And I'm going to give you an example, like a really simple example from a recent project that I worked on. This is avatars that just have like initials. It's just a circle. And the Figma designs that we had for this project, like almost every other project that I've seen, lay these things out in 2 dimensions, right? So in this example, we have the size on one dimension and the color on another dimension. And that's fantastic. And so I mentally log these as like different types of state that I need to consider when I'm going to build these things, right? I need maybe a prop for the size and the color or whatever system I'm using. I need to figure out how to do that, right? And then there's like another page in the design that has like another variation, right? Because components don't typically just have these 2 dimensions of state, right? So now I've got subtle as well as this bold variation. And I've got to ask the question, well, that's been answered for me. The subtle variation has all of the different size variations, and it also has all of the different color variations, albeit somewhere else on those scales that we were talking about. But then what happens when we introduce another one, right? Say a square variation of this component. I've got to ask the question, does the square version have all of the subtle colors as well as all of the bold colors as well as all of the sizes, right? So we've got to figure out like how these things combine, and we don't always do a good job of communicating these variations or how they change relative to component state when this sort of like comes down to meeting, you know, real world code. I don't think we communicate those assumptions of those things very well, and we end up making assumptions in the implementation, or there's gaps there. And again, that's kind of where stuff goes wrong, right? So that's modifier state. Behavior state is the other kind, and this is the one that like often gets mixed in the designs with the modifier state. But behavior state is something different because it does depend on application logic. Behavior state communicates something about the design or about a component, probably more about the component or the state of the application to the end user. So examples of these things might include like success, failure, loading indicators, the active item on a menu bar. There's a whole bunch of things that might be like different behaviors that a component can exhibit, right? They're not applied as a stylistic choice. And this is an example from everyone's favorite design system, Bootstrap, right? I wish I could see the chat right now. We often like I said, we often conflate the modifier and behavior state, but they really should be treated very differently, particularly when it comes to implementation, because the way that we manage those types of state is different in our applications. They might look similar, but whether you're a designer or developer or whatever, I think it's really important to have a conversation about which type of state this is, and therefore it should probably use like a different set of tokens in our design system as well. Let me show you a better example. So this is that same component from before that we were working on. And we got the default, but then we've got an error state when an email is not entered, and you can see that that changes the color. But it might also throw in there like a text message or something. So it's not just necessarily color. We might have a loading sort of state, like you've subscribed, you don't want to submit that twice. So it's giving you some feedback that, hey, I'm submitting that. And maybe it goes to a success state once the email subscription has been accepted. So that's behavioral state. And the third type of state that I want to talk about is pseudo state. So pseudo states are more temporary, and they usually map directly to persistent states in the browser, right? So they might be managed by the application, but typically like they're implementations of state that exists in the browser. These can include things like hover or focus or active, but they might also include like disabled or selected or other things. And they typically relate to input and interactive elements. So again, here's some examples. I might have a hover green. That's probably a terrible design, but that was my color palette. And then we might also have a focus state too, which might add like a border color, which is somewhere on the red scale, as well as changing the color of the button as well. These are all things we can do, and I think you understand pseudo state is probably the most intuitive one for anyone working in front end. The important thing to know is that these different types of state are finite. When we're developing components or drawing out our designs, we need to know what are all the possible combinations of this, like I was talking about before. And the solution to verifying that, lay these out in some kind of table so it can be easily understood. I typically do something like this. And then we need to consider how they combine, right? So typically you only have one modifier, one behavioral, and one pseudo state, right? So you can only have one state from each column. You can't have a large and small button. You can't have a button that's loading and success. Well, maybe sometimes you can have combinations of pseudo state, but that's kind of easier to resolve. But typically, yeah, you only have two of those things. And this means that when we have like a finite number of states in different categories, we can map them out into a tree like this. And then it's possible to know like how these things add to each other, and we end up with all of these different variations. If in doing this, we find out that, hey, I've got like, it particularly happens with behavioral states, where you're like, actually one of these behavioral states, like two of these behavioral states can exist at the same time, then you probably want to split them into different categories, right? So that's okay to do as well if you need to. So an example of that might be you have a to-do application, and it's either to do, it's doing, or it's done, right? And that's one type of behavioral state. And then you might have another type of behavioral state, which is what's happening with the network, where data is being fetched or something like that. But just a warning before you go and like split yourself into 6 categories of state is that if you find you're needing to do this, it's probably an indication that you have 2 components pretending to be one. And you can probably find a better way to split this up into smaller pieces and just work with 3 categories. Right. So once we know that, and we know that this can be additive, we can work out the total number of variations. We just multiply the possibilities. So with 3 types of state and 3 categories of state, so we have 3 times 3 times 3, and we get 27 possible variations. Right, but not every combination matters. So how many designers in the chat here do 27 different designs for a button? And I'm going to guess that like some of you are like, nah, I wouldn't do that. But I've seen 27 different buttons in one design system. So, but aside from buttons, you probably don't always map out 27 different variations. That would be silly. The disabled state might look the same for every type of modifier. The pseudo state might be the same for all of them, as it quite often is. So we can eliminate duplicate states. And here's an example here with 13 points of difference. And I think it's really important to know this. Hey, this UI component has 13 points of difference. And in this example, I can follow the tree and I can say, okay, like the disabled state's the same for everything, but they all have unique hover and focus. And yeah, you can add those up, and then we have criteria for developers to write tests. We have what we need for project managers to know what the scope and success completion criteria are for particular tasks. And designers, when you do this, like before you go and draw out all of the different variations, you have a better framework for communication with developers about state and behavior. And I just find like knowing this stuff or having these conversations makes that a whole lot easier. So now that we've talked about state and we've talked about design tokens, let's get to the bit where we sort of bring them back together. Remember component tokens? And I left you with the words of like they change depending on a different type of state, or that you work with these in a different way to theming. So now that we know what state is, it turns out that every type of state that we mentioned can be mapped back to a component token. So we're referencing aliases here. And those aliases we can have a component token for each type of state which references a different alias token. Or if it needs to, it can also reference a global token. So that's the circle. And the final thing that I want to add for developers in the talk in relation to theming, design systems, tokens, and state is that theming is kind of like different. We've just talked about 3 different types of state in detail, and there's specific rules for how and when you should apply those types of state, how you should combine them, how you should think about them. And similarly, there's rules for themes as well. So the domain of theming is mainly to manipulate token values, to change the value of a global token or to change what an alias token points to, and things like that. If you're switching your markup to deal with your theming, or you're changing which tokens are being used in the code because of theming, the chances are, again, you probably have 2 components trying to be one. And I would recommend that you try and hoist that logic up, like where you think that, hey, this component like changes dynamically its entire layout because of the theme, then you probably actually have 2 components. And you want to hoist the logic out to the presentational components, the layout or templating layer of your application, and then switch which component you're using there. Basically, if you're doing something and it feels weird, like in relation to implementing, or maybe that's good advice in general, stop and talk to your team. If you're doing something in implementing this stuff that doesn't feel right, just have a conversation about the different types of state and how you're using them and how it should be applied in this case. This isn't like easy stuff. The different names and things can throw us. But if we're able to like develop a shared language like we've tried to do today, it can really aid those conversations. And with respect to that, the final thing I want to leave you with is a bunch of questions that we can ask on a team of collaborative builders of web stuff. So the first one is, how many UI states does a component have? The second one is, can I easily validate the current UI state? Do I know, given a set of parameters, what the presentation of this UI component should be? And both the designers and the developers should be able to definitively say that. Another good question is, should I be using a global token or an alias token here within a component? Are we separating the application logic or that kind of state from our UI state when we're building components? That's a good one for developers to keep in mind. And most importantly, are we communicating our intentions to other developers and giving semantic meaning to the tokens and the components and basically all the things we build, because that's really what design systems are, a communication tool. Full circle, bang, that's the end of my talk. Thanks, Tom.
That was great. Mike, thank you for this. Can you unshare your screen so we can see you in your full glory?
I can do that.
Woo! There he is.
Whoa.
Mike, thank you so much. That made a lot of sense, and this is something that is is a very common issue. I think really working on the communication of what the designer intends so that the developer understands is at the heart of design systems. It's exactly that. Yeah. So I love it. I do have 2 questions. I have a question from Alex. How do you get developers and designers to use the correct token, for example, using CTA background instead of blue 500? How can we instill that?
Yeah, I guess it's in having a shared understanding of what a global token is, because it's not always clear, right? Like sometimes you start off thinking, oh, this is a global token, and then you talk with the designers and you decide collaboratively that actually that thing should change with the theme, or that thing's a part of the modifier state. But knowing all of those different terms and being able to have those discussions with a shared understanding of what we're talking about, I think that's the most important thing, because that's that shared understanding of what we're talking. That vocabulary is such an important thing. Yeah, and the only way you can do that is figuring it out at the start together.
Yep. it's almost like you need to talk to each other.
Yeah.
More. Another question from Isabel. Shouldn't UI state reflect app state?
Yeah, well, it does reflect app state in a lot of cases. That's kind of what the behavioral states do. The modifier states, they're kind of like stylistic choices, so they wouldn't necessarily reflect application state. But I think the important thing is like, it's not a direct mapping very often, like, or quite often it's not. Like you might have different, a whole lot of things contributing to the final, like you might have only like 3 behavioral states, but it might be a combination of a whole bunch of application logic that resolves those 3 things. So we want to make sure that we're going and like resolving those 3 things and then figuring out what styles to apply or what tokens to use. Otherwise, we end up just like switching individual CSS styles based on application logic inside the component layer, which is where I think it gets messy. It's kind of like, that's really hard to describe without like a solid example, but
yeah, fair enough.
Makes sense.
There's another question that just came in from Alad. You talked about separating out application state and presented network state as behavior state. I wouldn't consider network as a type of application state. Could you elaborate more on what you mean or trying to achieve here?
All right. I guess by application state, I mean stuff that's happening inside the application versus like the modifier state, which is something that's like, again, a stylistic concern. So like you'll have some code that will say, I'm going to go fetch this thing, right? And then your application has a state that is set that says, hey, I'm waiting for this thing. So you update your UI to say, I'm waiting for something. To me, that's application state. And then the network request comes back and you update that state in your application again, which is then reflected on your UI component. So that's what I guess I mean by application state there.
Yep, that makes sense. Miko says, Mike, alias token sound a lot like settings. Would you say there's a difference?
Did you say that again, Dom? You just cut out a little bit, mate.
Sorry. I said alias tokens sound a lot like settings. Would you say there's a distinct difference?
I'd have to, again, vocabulary stuff's important. I'd have to confirm with you what you mean by settings. But yes, I guess it's a... yeah, I guess.
Maybe theme settings. I guess that's very similar.
Yeah. I think you would apply them like at the top level. So like if you have a bunch of theme settings, you can either like switch a theme dynamically at the top level, and then that sets settings, and then that gets inherited the whole way around through. Or you can also have situations where like a section of the application can be within like applying a particular theme. All of that like really comes down to implementation, and I tried to sort of like steer away from specific examples in this and talk about it more generally. So yeah, I guess it comes down to the implementation there. I don't have a good quick answer for that one.
That's all right. There is a follow-up question to the question that we had earlier from Alex. What about larger? The question was about how do you make sure that designers use the correct token kind. What about a large organization where you might be 20 designers all working on the same design system? Do you have a suggestion for getting large groups to align to alias tokens, for instance?
Oh, not really. Like it's really hard, right? I wish I had like the perfect solution to that. Document it, build relationships in your teams. Like, I mean, I worked really hard on, like, we weren't quite as like mature about our thinking and talking about this 5-10 years ago or whatever. But when I was working in an Australian government, this was always like really hard, and you have different teams with different people with different levels of understanding. It really helps to show people examples, but like honestly, like it's just hard,
Maybe just go camping together.
Yeah,
something like that. Mike,
but, you know, you have some wins and you move forward with that kind of thing in large organizations slowly. And when I mean, big teams have done it, like the Adobe design system, right? Once you've got like something like that you can showcase, and like, I'm sure like internally that's received really well because it's received externally. And that happens too. Like if you can make a killer design system, if you can get it right with a smaller group of people, right? Like show some proof. But you know, that's all very dependent on your organization structure and how the organization works. And yeah, I mean, you've got experience with this, Dom. What would you say?
I think it's the bee's knees and the crux of it all. It doesn't matter what you communicate, as long as you somehow get to a point to communicate the same language and agree on it. And sometimes it helps to just create your language together.
Yes.
And then that helps too. There's a bunch of questions from Jess as well. And I'm not 100% sure if they are answers to a previous question because this is all delayed. But she was saying, wouldn't you want to create rules in a way hover styles are derived on error loading? For instance, focus outline for error and focus outline for primary are X% more saturated. So the rule is X% more saturated regardless of whether the something state is versus the other something state.
Yeah. Resolve those just in the components because you already have the token that it applies to. And if you can step up, maybe you can step up and down the scale, I guess. But if not, you need additional alias tokens for the specific, like you flatten it out, right? Like the specific error, focus, state, like whatever it is. I mentioned that, yes, pseudo states can sometimes combine in a way that the others typically don't. But typically too, I found that they're actually easier to manage because they're normally like just, small step, you know, like one little difference, or you create some special tokens for those things. That's never been too messy. That's never been the hardest part of implementing this stuff for me.
And then one last question from Alex. What is the weirdest token you've ever created?
Oh, I don't know because I don't always get to name them myself either. So yeah, I don't know. Probably like just something really specific that's really long. I don't know.
Fair enough. Mike, thank you so much for coming and giving that talk to a blank screen. You can't see anyone. You can't see chat. It's quite difficult, actually.
It's a weird feeling.
I know. Anyway, thanks for coming, and the video will be up shortly. Bye.
Thanks, Dom. Thanks for organizing all of this, mate.